Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving into support weapons. So this was a unit that I really didn't want to cover in the beginning of the edition because it was a toxic unit. It was very overpowered. I believe it only costed 85 points for a D cannon, and back then when Eldar could use as many fate dice as they wanted to, D cannons were annihilating entire Terminator units on Overwatch, which was just absolutely insane. But fast forward to today, and you have a much different story. Support weapons are actually, one of the more tame units in our index, in my opinion, although they are still very strong. And I do want to go into how to use them on the battlefield because they may actually be making somewhat of a comeback after the balanced data slate, particularly against the Necron Menace, which we will go into. But they're also very good against a lot of other factions. However, to use them properly, they do require a lot of strategic planning, which we will, of course, get right into. So what are we going to be looking at in today's video? So we're going to be doing a brief overview of the stats, weapons, and special rules of the support weapons, their strengths and weaknesses, combos and synergies, where support weapons fit into the current meta and are they worth using, and the role support weapons play in an Eldar army, and how to make the most out of them. So taking a look at the basic stat line of the support weapon, I think this is probably where they are the weakest because they don't have an impressive stat line. They're movement 3, so they're extremely slow. It's really hard to move these things around the battlefield and do anything of value as far as movement goes. They're pretty fragile as well at toughness 6 and wounds 5, making them more fragile than, both the Warwalker, of course, and also the Viper. Which the Viper is notoriously one of the most fragile vehicles in the entire game. So the fact that this thing is even more fragile than that is saying a lot. And because it only has a 4+ save, it does mean, unfortunately, that a lot of weapons are just going right through armor. So you're not even getting a save, and you're not even a lot of the times getting the ability to use a fate dice to save it. Unless, of course, it's in cover. So if you're in cover, you'll get a 6-up save, which means you could use a 6 on a fate dice to save this thing against a Bright Lance or something like that. But, it is kind of a lot of investment even then. You're already using the fate dice for other things. We're reduced in fate dice. So that is a problematic profile to start off. However, what it lacks in its profile, it more than makes up for in its damage. And what I'm talking about is, of course, the big D cannon. So the D cannon is a massively powerful weapon. 24-inch range, which is pretty short, but it has blast, devastating wounds, heavy and indirect fire, means it can fire out of line of sight, probably needed considering its short range. However, it also has heavy. So when you combine those two together, so you're kind of offsetting the negative penalty to hit, which it does need because it only has D3 attacks. So it doesn't have a whole lot of attacks. If you're firing indirectly, it's going to be hitting on 4s. Even with a reroll, that's a little bit dicey. So being able to hit on 3s when you stand still is helpful. It also has, of course, a massive strength of 16, which will basically wound anything in the game on a 3+ at least. AP -4 penetrates most armor except for 2+ armor saves, and does D6+2 damage, which is the same as a Bright Lance. It is, of course, a massively powerful weapon, and basically one of the only reasons why people take support weapons in their lists. However, we also do have the Shadow Weaver. The Shadow Weaver is also decent, although its role is a lot more niche, has a longer range, more attacks at D6+2, strength 6, AP 0, damage 1, so it's really only good against light infantry. However, it does have devastating wounds, so it can, pop an occasional wound on a tough target if you really need it. Also has heavy, indirect fire, and blast. So mostly you're going to be using this against light infantry targets, but occasionally can do some damage against heavies, just because of the fact that it has that devastating wounds. Now, the last weapon option is a bit of a meme, and that is because it is clearly the worst option out of the 3. And really the only place it belongs is at the end of the family planning section at your local pharmacy. And that is, of course, the Vibro Cannon. So the Vibro Cannon is a 40-inch range or 48-inch range, D6 attacks, 3+ to hit, strength 8, -1 AP, and damage 2, heavy weapon. Notice, though, that it does not have indirect fire, it does not have blast, and basically has no other special rules. It's almost as if when GW was writing this weapon, they just forgot. They just simply forgot to put the other special rules on it. No lethal hits, no sustained hits, which both would have made sense. Wouldn't have made it good, but it would have at least made some sense. However, doesn't have either of those. It's just simply strength 8, AP -1, damage 2. Which is, of course, awful. And considering it needs direct line of sight, it means, with that movement of 3 that it has, it's often just not going to be able to draw line of sight to key targets. Now, the support weapon also does come with a shuriken catapult for those extra juicy 3 inches plus D6 inches secondary objectives. So yes, because it's not artillery anymore like it is in 9th edition, you can in fact advance with this thing and actually score on secondary objectives, or at least be eligible to, because it's an assault weapon. So that is something that's kind of cool, but is it ever going to come into play? Probably not, because the movement value is so low, but it's possible. It's possible, guys. The last thing I want to mention, though, is that the real reason the shuriken catapult is good is because it can also proc the ability of the support weapon, which of course I will talk about in a second. As far as its melee weapons go, it has pretty rubbish combat, which is expected for a, artillery piece. It only has 2 attacks at strength 3, but, again, what can you expect from something that's not meant to be in combat? Okay, so as for its ability is Artillery Barrage. Now, this ability is actually pretty good. I don't think it's as good as a lot of the artillery-style abilities out there, but it is decent. So basically what it does is, when it hits a non-vehicle monster unit, that unit suffers a -1 to hit debuff. And the cool thing is like I mentioned before, the shuriken catapult can actually proc this if you have line of sight. So if you are running the D cannon and you really need to shoot something, but you also need to, put a debuff on an enemy unit, you can actually split fire, shoot the shuriken catapult at one thing, and shoot the D cannon at another. Which is something I have done in some situations. So it is obviously circumstantial, but sometimes, you're a little bit out of range with your D cannon. You have to move up to hit your target. You move up, and that basically puts you in line of sight of enemy units, but it also gives you line of sight to enemy units with the shuriken catapult. So you might as well shoot it, right? It's there. You might as well shoot it. Don't forget about it, because you can actually use it to debuff enemy units. Okay, so as for the war gear options, obviously it can be equipped with the D cannon, the Shadow Weaver, of course, or the meme Vibro cannon. 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to want to go with the D cannon, but that 1 time out of 10 when you're building a list to be, a little bit more defensive or maybe a little bit more debuff oriented, you might want to go with the Shadow Weaver. Now, as for its cost, I think when the edition started, it was obviously really OP because of its special rules. But now I think that really the only thing that's worth taking for the points is, of course, the D cannon, because it is 125, which puts it at above a Warwalker. It puts it at around the same cost as a Falcon, within 15 points, which is very expensive for the durability that it has. However, it is also a vehicle. And, unlike last edition when you couldn't charge with it because, again, it was an artillery piece, you absolutely can charge with it in this edition because it is a vehicle. It doesn't have any other keywords that prevent it from doing so. So you can actually move this thing up and charge, which is hilarious. And that means you can tank shock with it. Yes, you can tank shock. Now, the tank shock isn't good. It's at strength 3, so you're only rolling 3 dice with it. But, if you're in a pinch, you need to kill like that one model left in the unit to, cap the objective. Your support weapon, absolutely can do it. And I'm telling you, I haven't had a single instance of this happening yet, but if anybody out there has charged an enemy unit with their support weapon, tank shocked, killed the enemy unit, and then captured the objective, please let me know in the comments, because I just think this is absolutely hilarious if it did actually happen. And please, for the love of Isha, if this happens to anybody out there, please screenshot it for me, send it to the channel email, and I will post it up on the channel because that is absolutely epic, and it'd be one of the most epic ways to win the game that probably exists in the entire 40K universe. All right, so let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the D cannon, So we're going to be talking about each and every single option here because, I feel like the support weapons, you basically get a different unit for each different weapon you choose. So the D cannon, its strengths are that it's immensely powerful and it's basically able to wound anything on the game on a 3+ or better with really high AP and devastating wounds, which puts it on a pretty equal footing to a fire prism in the damage it can cause enemy large targets. It can also shoot targets out of line of sight with indirect fire, which is a very powerful tool when you have such a short range as well. So that is very cool. Its weaknesses, however, of course, are that it does have a very short range of 24 and a slow movement of 3. So it's not going to have the threat range that a lot of our units do. It also unfortunately suffers from being a little bit unreliable with the number of shots being D3. Now, I know that may seem like, not a big deal to a lot of you. D3 is a common, attack type for a lot of weapons like this, but it just means that on a 1 or a 2, you're only getting 1 shot. And typically speaking, D cannons, they're very fragile. So once they start shooting, they might not actually have that long to live. Even if they're hidden, typically you have to push these things up into the midboard to get key targets. And, if you want to make a trade with something much more expensive, you're going to have to risk that. And if you roll that 1, you're not going to be able to kill that vehicle. And unfortunately, the D cannon is going to die. Especially since Fire and Fade isn't really an option for this thing because, again, it's movement 3. So it's really not going to be that effective to be using that stratagem on a D cannon. And of course, it is very fragile and easily destroyed, which is a problem with support weapons this edition. That wasn't a problem last edition. Last edition, support weapons were actually pretty tough. But unfortunately, this edition, they're just, weak sauce durability, basically. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the Shadow Weaver and its strengths and weaknesses. So its strengths, obviously, are that it has a very long range at 48, can pretty much hit anything on the board. It has multiple devastating wound attacks, which is really good against infantry, but it's also good against, harder targets. If you only need 1 or 2 wounds on something, it can be clutch in desperate situations. And it is also effective at tagging infantry units, even if they're in the backfield, with a -1 to hit, which the D cannon typically is not going to be able to do, and is probably not going to be focused on. Its weaknesses, however, are that it has a very low damage output. For 125 points, only really being able to deal a couple of wounds to an infantry unit per turn is really bad, right? If you think about it this way, it's about 10 points less than a Basilisk, and a Basilisk is much better dealing damage, but also much better at controlling the battlefield. And also massively more durable. So I'm not one who likes to usually compare units from different armies, but they literally have the same role. They're both trying to hit units in the enemy backfield and control them or debuff them in some way, right? The Basilisk is controlling their movement, while the Shadow Weaver is debuffing their ability to hit and deal damage. However, there's clearly one that's just better than the other, even without accounting for things like orders and buffs and psychic powers and stuff like that. And, again, 125 points for something that can't even reliably kill 1 Space Marine is a little bit problematic. Okay, so on to the last option, and of course, it's the Vibro Cannon. Now, the Vibro Cannon is an absolute meme, and I would never recommend anybody actually using one in their list, even in casual games. Unless they're just trying to put together a list that is the absolute worst they can think of, I just don't understand why you would use this at all. And if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're like, but Proxy Hammer, I love Vibro Cannons. They're my favorite unit in the Eldar Index. I think they're great, super underrated. You know what? That's cool. Keep using the Vibro Cannon. But all I'm saying is that it doesn't look good on paper and it doesn't look good in the game because I've actually tried these things out a couple times. And they pretty much even struggle killing units that they're supposed to be able to kill because of their really low AP and they have no abilities, right? So, even against things like scouts, they really even struggle killing those and being cost effective against those. So just not a very good unit, not a very cost effective one either. So what are the strengths of this thing? Does it have any? Well, I think the main strength of the Vibro Cannon is, of course, it's really funny to make jokes about, because of the way it looks, because of its name, it's very easily made fun of, and, that's its biggest strength in my opinion. And perhaps even it can make your opponent laugh so much that they just lose focus, and that can give you a real edge in the mental games that the Eldar like to play on their enemies. However, it does have weaknesses that you have to consider. It needs direct line of sight. It has a very low damage output, which means it's probably not going to kill anything. And it's very expensive and fragile. So unfortunately, unless your opponent is prone to hysterical bouts of laughter, which will throw them off their game, the Vibro Cannon is just not going to be a very good pick. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the combos and synergies available to each weapon. So for the D Cannon, I think Doom really helps it wound against tough targets. So anything that it's going to be wounding on 3s, it's going to be much more reliable if it's wounding on 2s. And I know that may not seem like a big deal because you do get a reroll with the detachment bonus. But, in my experience, with something that is already a little bit unreliable, it might help to have that +1 to wound anyway. Vipers can also remove cover from targets to ensure that the D Cannon completely ignores armor, even against things with a 2-up save. And technically, if you're shooting at a Land Raider or something like that, and it is getting the benefit of cover, it's only going to be getting a 6-up. So, that is pretty good to force an opponent's Land Raider to a 6-up save. As far as the Shadow Weaver goes, Guide does help it hit more reliably. So if you really need to kill that unit of cultists or, unit of Crude Hounds or something like that that's in the enemy backfield or, kind of hiding out in the midfield somewhere, then Guide can help it hit and make sure that that unit dies. Doom can help it hit a bit harder as well against, mech-style targets if it needs to deal some extra wounds here and there. And, well, Shroud Runners can give it lethal hits, but, it's probably not worth it to use on the Shadow Weaver. And I think overall, truthfully, the damage isn't really why you take this thing. This thing is really more to put pressure on light infantry in the opponent's backfield, force them to put something substantial on the, home objective, like something like Space Marines or, Chaos Space Marines, something a little sturdier, so that you have one less strong unit to deal with in the midfield. It's also, of course, great at passing out that -1 to hit debuff against basically anything you wanted to. So that's going to be its primary function, not actually dealing any real damage. Lastly, the Vibro Cannon, really, as far as its combos and synergies, it does vibe with Doom, Guide, Ignores Cover, and any other shooting buffs, basically. But it's really not worth using any of those on this weapon because it's going to be dead as soon as it pops out of cover, and it's not going to do any damage. So, you might as well not even waste the time. Okay, so where do support weapons fit into the current meta, and are they worth using? So first of all, D-Cannons are extremely powerful weapons, but they are a bit unreliable with the D3 tax, and you do have to consider that when including them in your list, right? Warwalkers are cheaper, and even though they do less damage, technically, they are more reliable because, you're always going to get 2 attacks and they're always going to be hitting targets within line of sight pretty reliably on a 3+, right? Warwalkers also have more movement and can do other stuff in the game that, support weapons just can't, right? So you do have to consider the unreliability of this weapon when trying to include it in your list. However, being able to hit a monster or vehicle with devastating wounds is extremely strong. There's a lot of strong monsters and vehicles out there with invul saves that you can get past if you bring a D-Cannon. And aside from the obsolete Wraith Knight, it does have the highest single weapon damage of any D weapon in the index. So that devastating wounds is going to be D6 plus 2, which is pretty good. Typically speaking, you're going to get about, 4 to 5 wounds with this thing, going right through armor and invuls. Per devastating wound proc, of course. The Shadow Weaver has a more niche role of debuffing enemies with -1 to hit, which could be good against a lot of armies out there that are really good at shooting. So one of the things that I've noticed it's good at is debuffing targets that rely on throwing out a bunch of attacks to deal damage. Things like Necron Immortals, right? So, hitting a unit of Necron Immortals with this thing means that when they do come out, they're going to be doing a lot less damage. Now, their sustained is still going to go through, but, all those other attacks that aren't sustained hits are going to be missing a lot more frequently, which is pretty strong. I don't know if it's 125 points strong, but it is something to consider if you're having trouble dealing with those types of units. Necrons also have a lot of tough vehicles and units as well, so Canoptic Wraiths, Monoliths, Doomstalkers, etc. Basically all of their vehicles have a 4+ invul save and a pretty decent armor save, so having something that can ignore both of those is pretty powerful. However, do keep in mind that they're not an answer to Satan Shards, which half all damage and have a feel no pain of 5+. So D-Cannons, even if you spend the Fate dice to push through the invul save, they're still going to be getting that feel no pain 5+, which, on top of half damage, it's going to mean you're not going to be doing much at all against them. I think on average you'll put about 3 wounds on a Satan Shard with a D-Cannon using a Fate dice for devastating wounds, and that's just not nearly enough to actually bring it down. Now, what I will say is that even though anti-large weapons seem to be very ineffective against Satans, anything with lethal hits and a numerable amount of attacks is going to just be better against them. And the reason why is because, yes, they have a 4+ invul save, but they don't have any good armor save. So what that means is, if you can just push a bunch of damage 1 through, oftentimes that gets past their half damage, of course, because you can't go lower than 1, and the feel no pain, while powerful, isn't going to negate as much. It's still obviously going to negate 33% of the attacks that go through, but typically speaking, you can kind of get more reliable wounds through that way than, going through a half damage parameter and then also having to deal with feel no pain on top of that. So I'm actually thinking things like Shroud Runners might be a lot better against a Satan, just because of the fact that they can put lethal hits on them and then the rest of your army can shoot, shuriken cannons and scatter lasers and stuff at them and just deal damage to them that way. Fire Dragons are also probably pretty good against them just because of the fact that they have Melta 3, which means that, of course, the half damage applies first, and then you add the +3 after. So on average, you're doing considerably more damage than other weapons would in your army. So, another reason why you're probably going to see a lot of Fire Dragons out there. Imperial Guard Super Heavies also are apparently on the rise, and these are very strong against them as well. So, D-Cannons, while they can't deal with Satan, they can definitely deal with Imperial Guard Super Heavies, wounding on a 3+, being able to shoot out of line of sight, and deal heavy damage. So yeah, while D-Cannons and Shadow Weavers might not be somebody's first pick for, a unit to include in their army, they are certainly a competitive consideration considering how the meta is starting to evolve. Now, there are a few things and tips to keep in mind, though, when using the D-Cannon, because the D-Cannon is not your typical anti-large platform, so you do need to use a little bit of trickery to get the most out of it. So due to its short range, keeping them in reserve is a really good idea. I know a lot of people just want to deploy them on the board to act as a control piece, but they're not how they were last edition. Last edition, you could take them in units of 3, and they were really good at controlling the board. But this edition, unfortunately, they're just too easy to take out. And because you can't overwatch against enemy units within 24 inches out of line of sight, they're really not good at controlling the board anymore. So putting them in reserve is a really good idea, especially since indirect fire and fast-moving assault units can also very easily take these things out. And also, as a bonus, putting them in reserve really makes your opponent think about where they want to move their units, and that could play to your advantage. So what is the role of support weapons in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of them? So the D-Cannon is a powerful anti-large tool, especially effective against units with high armor and good invul saves, but unfortunately won't be a good answer to things like the Satan Shard. The Shadow Weaver, on the other hand, is a more niche pick that's good at reducing the effectiveness of powerful shooting units in the enemy's backfield. And both the Shadow Weaver and D-Cannon, just support weapons in general, really need to be screened or put in reserve, or they will be destroyed extremely quickly. So another example is if your opponent doesn't have indirect fire or a fast-moving assault unit, more often than not, you're going to go against Space Marines, right? That's the most common opponent that most people go up against in their local game store. And of course, Inceptors are a very popular unit among pretty much all Space Marines players. And Inceptors with plasma guns, or the plasma pistol things that they have, are going to absolutely devastate support weapons. There's just nothing you can really do. They come within 3 inches of it, and they blow it up. And that's it. You can't overwatch because it's not going to kill enough. You may kill one Inceptor, but the other two are likely going to destroy it. So that's not really worth it. And, essentially what that means is that the Inceptors are going to get a good trade each and every time. So you need to make sure that, if you can't screen them out against everything, just throw them in reserve. Because that way you ensure that you at least get one round of shooting on your opponent. All right, so in conclusion, support weapons are a very powerful tool at your disposal, but can be tricky to use for their cost. The D cannon is the most attractive out of the three options due to its ability to hit extremely hard against tough targets that Bright Lances just can't. And as we're evolving in the meta more, I think we're understanding that Bright Lances are not the answer to everything, right? Because our Bright Lances, quite frankly, are more expensive now. In the beginning of the edition, right after the Fire Prisms got nerfed, people started just using Bright Lances. But as we can now see with the nerf to Fate dice, Bright Lances are going to be a lot less reliable and a lot harder to take advantage of throughout the game because of the mere fact that you can't use as many Fate dice. And you're going to have to use them a lot more wisely for different things, not just shooting, but also things like advance rolls and stuff like that. So, basically, other weapons are now becoming a consideration. Bright Lances aren't the only option we have anymore. We also have to consider other things. Fire Prisms are another very good option, but D cannons are also a reasonable option as well. Because unlike the Bright Lances against Toughness 13, if you're going up against monoliths, a support weapon is going to be able to do reasonable damage to it, whereas a Bright Lance most likely will bounce right off. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Let me know if I forgot anything about support weapons. I haven't been using them for a little bit now, but I've been starting to use them again after the nerfs. They do feel pretty good, but they also do feel very fragile. So let me know what you guys think about them in the comment section below. And thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your support has really helped the channel grow, and I am very grateful for it. If you do want to help support the channel and become a channel patron, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page to rep your local game store, or you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave those links in the description below as well. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.